Join us on an extraordinary journey with Ransom, the protagonist of C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, as he ventures into the unknown territories of Malacandra. In chapters 14 through 17, Ransom navigates through dangerous forests and encounters diverse alien species, each with their unique cultures and philosophies. From the enigmatic Sorns to the harmonious Rasa, watch as Ransom evolves from a wary traveler to a determined explorer, embracing the challenges of his extraordinary mission. Witness his struggle for survival, his deep reflections on the nature of the beings he meets, and his growing understanding of his role in a universe far broader and more complex than he ever imagined. Experience the suspense, the revelations, and the profound connections that make this journey not just a tale of interplanetary adventure, but a significant expedition of self-discovery and universal truth. Stay tuned as we delve into Ransom's compelling narrative, exploring themes of courage, duty, and the pursuit of knowledge beyond our world.
Chapter 14. Until he reached the wood, Ransom found it difficult to think of anything except the possibility of another rifle bullet from Weston or Devine. He thought that they probably still wanted him alive rather than dead, and this, combined with the knowledge that a Frost was watching him, enabled him to proceed with at least external composure. Even when he had entered the forest, he felt himself in considerable danger. The long, branchless stems made cover only if you were very far away from the enemy, and the enemy in this case might be very close. He became aware of a strong impulse to shout out to Weston and Devine and give himself up. It rationalized itself in the form that this would remove them from the district, as they would probably take him off to the Sorns and leave the Hrossa unmolested. But Ransom knew a little psychology and had heard of the hunted man's irrational instinct to give himself up. Indeed, he had felt it himself in dreams. It was some such trick, he thought, that his nerves were now playing him. In any case, he was determined henceforward to obey the Hrossa, or Eldila. His efforts to rely on his own judgment in Malacandra had so far ended tragically enough. He made a strong resolution, defying in advance all changes of mood, that he would faithfully carry out the journey to Meldilorn if it could be done. This resolution seemed to him all the more certainly right because he had the deepest misgivings about that journey. He understood that the Harandra, which he had to cross, was the home of the Sorns. In fact, he was walking of his own free will into the very trap that he had been trying to avoid ever since his arrival on Malacandra. Here, the first change of mood tried to raise its head. He thrust it down. And even if he got through the Sorns and reached Meldilorn, who or what might Oyarsa be? Oyarsa, Wynne had ominously observed, did not share the Hrossa's objection to shedding the blood of a Hnahu. And again, Oyarsa ruled Sorns as well as Hrossa and Pfiffeltriggi. Perhaps he was simply the Arch-Sorn. And now came the second change of mood. Those old terrestrial fears of some alien, cold intelligence, superhuman in power, subhuman in cruelty, which had utterly faded from his mind among the Hrossa, rose clamoring for readmission. But he strode on. He was going to Meldilorn. It was not possible, he told himself, that the Hrossa should obey an evil or monstrous creature. And they had told him, or had they, he was not quite sure, that Oyarsa was not a Sorn. Was Oyarsa a god? Perhaps that very idol to whom the Sorns wanted to sacrifice him. But the Hrossa, though they said strange things about him, clearly denied that he was a god. There was one god, according to them, Maleldil, the Young. Nor was it possible to imagine Hjoi or Hnohra worshipping a blood-stained idol. Unless, of course, the Hrossa were after all under the thumb of the Sorns, superior to their masters in all the qualities that human beings value, but intellectually inferior to them and dependent on them. It would be a strange, but not an inconceivable world. Heroism and poetry at the bottom, cold scientific intellect above it, and overtopping all, some dark superstition which scientific intellect, helpless against the revenge of the emotional depths it had ignored, had neither will nor power to remove. A mumbo-jumbo. But Ransom pulled himself up. He knew too much now to talk that way. He and all his class would have called the Eldila a superstition if they had been merely described to them, but now he had heard the voice himself. No, Oyarsa was a real person, if he was a person at all. He had now been walking for about an hour, and it was nearly midday. No difficulty about his direction had yet occurred. He had merely to keep going uphill, and he was certain of coming out of the forests to the mountain wall sooner or later. Meanwhile, he felt remarkably well, though greatly chastened in mind. The silent purple half-light of the woods spread all around him as it had spread on the first day he spent in Malacandra, but everything else was changed. He looked back on that time as on a nightmare, on his own mood at that time as a sort of sickness. Then all had been whimpering, unanalyzed, self-nourished, self-consuming dismay. Now, in the clear light of an accepted duty, he felt fear, indeed, but with it a sober sense of confidence in himself and in the world, and even an element of pleasure. It was the difference between a landsman in a sinking ship and a horseman on a bolting horse. Either may be killed, but the horseman is an agent as well as a patient. About an hour after noon, he suddenly came out of the wood into bright sunshine. He was only 20 yards from the almost perpendicular bases of the mountain spires, too close to them to see their tops. A sort of valley ran up in the re-entrant between two of them at the place where he had emerged. An unclimbable valley consisting of a single concave sweep of stone, which in its lower parts ascended steeply as the roof of a house, and farther up seemed almost vertical. At the top it even looked as if it hung over a bit, like a tidal wave of stone at the very moment of breaking. But this he thought might be an illusion. He wondered what the Frosses' idea of a road might be. He began to work his way southward along the narrow, broken ground between wood and mountain. Great spurs of the mountains had to be crossed every few moments, and even in that lightweight world it was intensely tiring. After about half an hour he came to a stream. Here he went a few paces into the forest, cut himself an ample supply of the ground weed, and sat down beside the water's edge for lunch. When he had finished, he filled his pockets with what he had not eaten, and proceeded. He began soon to be anxious about his road, for if he could make the top at all, he could do it only by daylight, and the middle of the afternoon was approaching. But his fears were unnecessary. When it came, it was unmistakable. An open way through the wood appeared on the left. He must be somewhere behind the Frost village now. And on the right he saw the road, a single ledge, or in places a trench, cut sidewise and upwards across the sweep of such a valley as he had seen before. It took his breath away, the insanely steep, hideously narrow staircase without steps, leading up and up from where he stood to where it was an almost invisible thread on the pale green surface of the rock. But there was no time to stand and look at it. He was a poor judge of heights, but he had no doubt that the top of the road was removed from him by a more than alpine distance. It would take him at least till sundown to reach it. Instantly he began the ascent. Such a journey would have been impossible on earth. The first quarter of an hour would have reduced a man of Ransom's build and age to exhaustion. Here he was at first delighted with the ease of his movement, and then staggered by the gradient and length of the climb, which, even under Malacandrian conditions, soon bowed his back and gave him an aching chest and trembling knees. But this was not the worst. He heard already a singing in his ears, and noticed that despite his labor there was no sweat on his forehead. The cold, increasing at every step, seemed to sap his vitality worse than any heat could have done. Already his lips were cracked. His breath as he panted showed like a cloud. His fingers were numb. He was cutting his way up into a silent Arctic world, and had already passed from an English to a Lapland winter. It frightened him, and he decided that he must rest here or not at all. 100 paces more, and if he sat down he would sit forever. He squatted on the road for a few minutes, slapping his body with his arms. The landscape was terrifying. Already the Handramit which had made his world for so many weeks was only a thin purple cleft sunk amidst the boundless level desolation of the Harandra, which now, on the farthest side, showed clearly between and above the mountain peaks. But long before he was rested, he knew that he must go on or die. The world grew stranger. Among the Hrossa he had almost lost the feeling of being on a strange planet. Here it returned upon him with a desolating force. It was no longer the world, scarcely even a world. It was a planet, a star, a waste place in the universe, millions of miles from the world of men. It was impossible to recall what he had felt about Hioy, or Hwin, or the Eldila, or Oyarsa. It seemed fantastic to have thought he had duties to such hobgoblins, if they were not hallucinations, met in the wilds of space. He had nothing to do with them. He was a man. Why had Weston and Devine left him alone like this? But all the time the old resolution, taken when he could still think, was driving him up the road. Often he forgot where he was going and why. The movement became a mechanical rhythm, from weariness to stillness, from stillness to unbearable cold, from cold to motion again. He noticed that the Handramit, now an insignificant part of the landscape, was full of a sort of haze. He had never seen a fog while he was living there. Perhaps that was what the air of the Handramit looked like from above. Certainly it was a different air from this. There was something more wrong with his lungs and heart than even the cold and the exertion accounted for. And though there was no snow, there was an extraordinary brightness. The light was increasing, sharpening and growing whiter, and the sky was a much darker blue than he had ever seen on Malacandra. Indeed, it was darker than blue. It was almost black, and the jagged spires of rock standing against it were like his mental picture of a lunar landscape. Some stars were visible. Suddenly he realized the meaning of these phenomena. There was very little air above him. He was near the end of it. The Malacandrian atmosphere lay chiefly in the Handramits. The real surface of the planet was naked or thinly clad. The stabbing sunlight and the black sky above him were that heaven out of which he had dropped into the Malacandrian world, already showing through the last thin veil of air. If the top were more than 100 feet away, it would be where no man could breathe at all. He wondered whether the Hrossa had different lungs and had sent him by a road that meant death for man. But even while he thought of this, he took note that those jagged peaks blazing in sunlight against an almost black sky were level with him. He was no longer ascending, and on his right by a smooth, ascending swell of stone that ran up to the true Harandra. And where he was, he could still breathe, though gasping, dizzy and in pain. The blaze in his eyes was worse. The sun was setting. The Hrossa must have foreseen this. They could not live any more than he on the Harandra by night. Still staggering forward, he looked about him for any sign of Augre's tower, whatever Augre might be. Doubtless he exaggerated the time during which he thus wandered and watched the shadows from the rocks lengthening towards him. It cannot really have been long before he saw a light ahead, a light which showed how dark the surrounding landscape had become. He tried to run, but his body would not respond. Stumbling in haste and weakness, he made for the light. Thought he had reached it, and found that it was far farther than he had supposed. Almost despaired, staggered on again, and came at last to what seemed a cavern mouth. The light within was an unsteady one, and a delicious wave of warmth smote on his face. It was firelight. He came into the mouth of the cave, and then, unsteadily, round the fire into the interior, and stood still blinking in the light. When at last he could see, he discerned a smooth chamber of green rock, very lofty. There were two things in it. One of them, dancing on the wall and roof, was the huge, angular shadow of a Sorn. The other, crouching beneath it, was the Sorn himself. Chapter 15. "Come in, small one," boomed the Sorn. "Come in and let me look at you." Now that he stood face to face with the spectre that had haunted him ever since he had set foot on Malacandra, Ransom felt a surprising indifference. He had no idea what might be coming next, but he was determined to carry out his program, and in the meantime the warmth and more breathable air were a heaven in themselves. He came in, well in past the fire, and answered the Sorn. His own voice sounded to him a shrill treble. "The Hrossa have sent me to look for Oyarsa," he said. The Sorn peered at him. "You are not from this world," it said suddenly. "No," replied Ransom, and sat down. He was too tired to explain. "I think you are from Thulcandra, small one," said the Sorn. "Why?" said Ransom. "You are small and thick, and that is how the animals ought to be made in a heavier world. You cannot come from Glundandra, for it is so heavy that if any animals could live there, they would be flat like plates. Even you, small one, would break if you stood up on that world. I do not think you are from Paralandra, for it must be very hot. If any came from there, they would not live when they arrived here. So I conclude you are from Thulcandra." "The world I come from is called Earth by those who live there," said Ransom, "and it is much warmer than this. Before I came into your cave, I was nearly dead with cold and thin air." The Sorn made a sudden movement with one of its long forelimbs. Ransom stiffened, though he did not allow himself to retreat, for the creature might be going to grab him. In fact, its intentions were kindly. Stretching back into the cave, it took from the wall what looked like a cup. Then Ransom saw that it was attached to a length of flexible tube. The Sorn put it into his hands. "Smell on this," it said. "The Hrossa also need it when they pass this way." Ransom inhaled and was instantly refreshed. His painful shortness of breath was eased, and the tension of chest and temples was relaxed. The Sorn in the lighted cavern, hitherto vague and dreamlike to his eyes, took on a new reality. "Oxygen?" he asked, but naturally the English word meant nothing to the Sorn. "Are you called Ogre?" he asked. "Yes," said the Sorn. "What are you called?" "The animal I am is called Man, and therefore the Hrossa call me Haman, but my own name is Ransom." "Man. Rensum," said the Sorn. He noticed that it spoke differently from the Hrossa, without any suggestion of their persistent initial H. It was sitting on its long, wedge-shaped buttocks, with its feet drawn close up to it. A man in the same posture would have rested his chin on his knees, but the Sorn's legs were too long for that. Its knees rose high above its shoulders on each side of its head, grotesquely suggestive of huge ears, and the head, down between them, rested its chin on the protruding breast. The creature seemed to have either a double chin or a beard. Ransom could not make out which in the firelight. It was mainly white or cream in color, and seemed to be clothed down to the ankles in some soft substance that reflected the light. On the long, fragile shanks, where the creature was closest to him, he saw that this was some natural kind of coat. It was not like fur, but more like feathers. In fact, it was almost exactly like feathers. The whole animal, seen at close quarters, was less terrifying than he had expected, and even a little smaller. The face, it was true, took a good deal of getting used to. It was too long, too solemn, and too colorless, and it was much more unpleasantly like a human face than any inhuman creature's face ought to be. Its eyes, like those of all very large creatures, seemed too small for it. But it was more grotesque than horrible. A new conception of the Sorns began to arise in his mind. The ideas of giant and ghost receded behind those of goblin and gawk. "Perhaps you are hungry, small one," it said. Ransom was. The Sorn rose with strange, spidery movements and began going to and fro about the cave, attended by its thin goblin shadow. It brought in the usual vegetable foods of Malacandra and strong drink, with the very welcome addition of a smooth brown substance which revealed itself to nose, eye, and palate, in defiance of all probability, as cheese. Ransom asked what it was. The Sorn began to explain painfully how the female of some animals secreted a fluid for the nourishment of its young, and would have gone on to describe the whole process of milking and cheese-making if Ransom had not interrupted it. Yes, he said, "we do the same on Earth. What is the beast you use?" "It is a yellow beast with a long neck. It feeds on the forests that grow in the Handramit. The young ones of our people who are not yet fit for much else drive the beasts down there in the mornings and follow them while they feed. Then before night they drive them back and put them in the caves." For a moment Ransom found something reassuring in the thought that the Sorns were shepherds. Then he remembered that the Cyclops in Homer plied the same trade. "I think I have seen one of your people at this very work," he said. But the Hrossa, they let you tear up their forests? Why should they not? Do you rule the Hrossa? Oyarsa rules them. And who rules you? Oyarsa. But you know more than the Hrossa. The Hrossa know nothing except about poems and fish and making things grow out of the ground. And Oyarsa, is he a thorn? No, no, small one. I have told you he rules all Nahu. So he pronounced Nahu, and everything in Malacandra. I do not understand this Oyarsa, said Ransom. Tell me more. Oyarsa does not die, said the Thorn, and he does not breed. He is the one of his kind who was put into Malacandra to rule it when Malacandra was made. His body is not like ours, nor yours. It is hard to see, and the light goes through it. Like an Eldil? Yes, he is the greatest of Eldila who ever come to Ahandra. What are these Eldila? Do you tell me, small one, that there are no Eldila in your world? The story is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Out of the Silent Planet continued. Do you tell me, small one, that there are no Eldila in your world? Not that I know of. But what are Eldila, and why can I not see them? Have they no bodies? Of course they have bodies. There are a great many bodies you cannot see. Every animal's eyes see some things, but not others. Do you not know of many kinds of body in Thulkandra? Ransom tried to give the Thorn some idea of the terrestrial terminology of solids, liquids, and gases. It listened with great attention. That is not the way to say it, it replied. Body is movement. If it is at one speed, you smell something. If at another, you hear a sound. If at another, you see a sight. If at another, you neither see nor hear nor smell, nor know the body in any way. But mark this, small one, that the two ends meet. How do you mean? If movement is faster, then that which moves is more nearly in two places at once. That is true. But if the movement were faster still, it is difficult, for you do not know many words. You see that if you made it faster and faster, in the end the moving thing would be in all places at once, small one. I think I see that. Well then, that is the thing at the top of all bodies, so fast that it is at rest, so truly body that it has ceased being body at all. But we will not talk of that. Start from where we are, small one. The swiftest thing that touches our senses is light. We do not truly see light. We only see slower things lit by it, so that for us, light is on the edge, the last thing we know before things become too swift for us. But the body of an Eldil is a movement swift as light. You may say its body is made of light, but not of that which is light for the Eldil. His light is a swifter movement which for us is nothing at all. And what we call light is for him a thing like water, a visible thing, a thing he can touch and bathe in, even a dark thing when not illumined by the swifter. And what we call firm things, flesh and earth, seem to him thinner and harder to see than our light, and more like clouds, and nearly nothing. To us the Eldil is a thin, half-real body that can go through walls and rocks. To himself he goes through them because he is solid and firm, and they are like clouds. And what is true light to him, and fills the heaven, so that he will plunge into the rays of the sun to refresh himself from it, is to us the black nothing in the sky at night. These things are not strange, small one, though they are beyond our senses. But it is strange that the Eldila never visit Thulkandra. Of that I am not certain, said Ransom. It had dawned on him that the recurrent human tradition of bright, elusive people sometimes appearing on the earth, Albs, Devas, and the like, might, after all, have another explanation than the anthropologists had yet given. True, it would turn the universe rather oddly inside out, but his experiences in the spaceship had prepared him for some such operation. Why does Oyarsa send for me? He asked. "Oyarsa has not told me," said the Sorn, "but doubtless he would want to see any stranger from another Handra." "We have no Oyarsa in my world," said Ransom. "That is another proof," said the Sorn, "that you come from Thulkandra, the silent planet." "What has that to do with it?" The Sorn seemed surprised. "It is not very likely, if you had an Oyarsa, that he would never speak to ours." "Speak to yours? But how could he? It is millions of miles away." "Oyarsa would not think of it like that." "Do you mean that he ordinarily receives messages from other planets?" Once again, he would not say it that way. Oyarsa would not say that he lives on Malacandra, and that another Oyarsa lives on another Earth. For him, Malacandra is only a place in the heavens. It is in the heavens that he and the others live. Of course they talk together. Ransom's mind shied away from the problem. He was getting sleepy and thought he must be misunderstanding the Sorn. "I think I must sleep, Augre," he said, "and I do not know what you are saying. Perhaps, too, I do not come from what you call Thulkandra." "We will both sleep presently," said the Sorn, "but first I will show you Thulkandra." It rose, and Ransom followed it into the back of the cave. Here he found a little recess, and running up within it a winding stair. The steps, hewn for Sorns, were too high for a man to climb with any comfort, but using hands and knees he managed to hobble up. The Sorn preceded him. Ransom did not understand the light, which seemed to come from some small round object which the creature held in its hand. They went up a long way, almost as if they were climbing up the inside of a hollow mountain. At last, breathless, he found himself in a dark but warm chamber of rock, and heard the Sorn saying, "She is still well above the southern horizon." It directed his attention to something like a small window. Whatever it was, it did not appear to work like an earthly telescope, Ransom thought. Though an attempt made next day to explain the principles of the telescope to the Sorn threw grave doubts on his own ability to discern the difference. He leaned forward with his elbows on the sill of the aperture and looked. He saw perfect blackness, and, floating in the center of it, seemingly an arm's length away, a bright disk about the size of a half-crown. Most of its surface was featureless, shining silver. Towards the bottom markings appeared, and below them a white cap, just as he had seen the polar caps in astronomical photographs of Mars. He wondered for a moment if it was Mars he was looking at. Then, as his eyes took in the markings better, he recognized what they were: Northern Europe and a piece of North America. They were upside down, with the North Pole at the bottom of the picture, and this somehow shocked him. But it was the Earth he was seeing, even perhaps England, though the picture shook a little, and his eyes were quickly getting tired, and he could not be certain that he was not imagining it. It was all there in that little disk: London, Athens, Jerusalem, Shakespeare. There everyone had lived and everything had happened, and there, presumably, his pack was still lying on the porch of an empty house near Stirk. "Yes," he said dully to the Sorn, "that is my world." It was the bleakest moment in all his travels. Chapter 16. Ransom awoke next morning with the vague feeling that a great weight had been taken off his mind. Then he remembered that he was the guest of a Sorn, and that the creature he had been avoiding ever since he landed had turned out to be as amicable as the Hrossa, though he was far from feeling the same affection for it. Nothing then remained to be afraid of in Malacandra except Oyarsa. The last fence, thought Ransom. Augre gave him food and drink. "And now," said Ransom, "how shall I find my way to Oyarsa?" "I will carry you," said the Sorn. "You are too small a one to make the journey yourself, and I will gladly go to Meldalorn. The Hrossa should not have sent you this way. They do not seem to know from looking at an animal what sort of lungs it has, and what it can do. It is just like a Hross. If you died on the Harandra, they would have made a poem about the gallant Haman, and how the sky grew black and the cold stars shone, and he journeyed on and journeyed on, and they would have put in a fine speech for you to say as you were dying. And all this would seem to them just as good as if they had used a little forethought and saved your life by sending you the easier way round. "I like the Hrossa," said Ransom a little stiffly, "and I think the way they talk about death is the right way." "They are right not to fear it," read Sum, "but they do not seem to look at it reasonably as part of the very nature of our bodies, and therefore often avoidable at times when they would never see how to avoid it. For example, this has saved the life of many a Hross, but a Hross would not have thought of it." He showed Ransom a flask with a tube attached to it, and at the end of the tube a cup, obviously an apparatus for administering oxygen to oneself. "Smell on it as you have need, small one," said the Sorn, "and close it up when you do not." Ogre fastened the thing on his back and gave the tube over his shoulder into his hand. Ransom could not restrain a shudder at the touch of the Sorn's hands upon his body. They were fan-shaped, 7-fingered, mere skin over bone like a bird's leg, and quite cold. To divert his mind from such reactions, he asked where the apparatus was made, for he had as yet seen nothing remotely like a factory or a laboratory. "We thought it," said the Sorn, "and the Pfiffeltriggy made it." "Why do they make them?" said Ransom. He was trying once more, with his insufficient vocabulary, to find out the political and economic framework of Malacandrian life. "They like making things," said Orgrave. "It is true they like best the making of things that are only good to look at and of no use. But sometimes when they are tired of that, they will make things for us, things we have thought, provided they are difficult enough. They have not patience to make easy things, however useful they would be. But let us begin our journey. You shall sit on my shoulder." The proposal was unexpected and alarming, but seeing that the Sorn had already crouched down, Ransom felt obliged to climb onto the plume-like surface of its shoulder, to seat himself beside the long, pale face, casting his right arm as far as it would go round the huge neck, and to compose himself as well as he could for his precarious mode of travel. The giant rose cautiously to a standing position, and he found himself looking down on the landscape from a height of about 18 feet. "All is well, small one?" it asked. "Very well," Ransom answered, and the journey began. Its gait was perhaps the least human thing about it. It lifted its feet very high and set them down very gently. Ransom was reminded alternately of a cat stalking, a strutting barn-door fowl, and a high-stepping carriage horse. But the movement was not really like that of any terrestrial animal. For the passenger it was surprisingly comfortable. In a few minutes he had lost all sense of what was dizzying or unnatural in his position. Instead, ludicrous and even tender associations came crowding into his mind. It was like riding an elephant at the zoo in boyhood, like riding on his father's back at a still earlier age. It was fun. They seemed to be doing between 6 and 7 miles an hour. The cold, though severe, was endurable, and thanks to the oxygen, he had little difficulty with his breathing. The landscape which he saw from his high, swaying post of observation was a solemn one. The Handramit was nowhere to be seen. On each side of the shallow gully in which they were walking, a world of naked, faintly greenish rock, interrupted with wide patches of red, extended to the horizon. The heaven, darkest blue where the rock met it, was almost black at the zenith, and, looking in any direction where the sunlight did not blind him, he could see the stars. He learned from the Sorn that he was right in thinking they were near the limits of the breathable. Already on the mountain fringe that borders the Harandra and walls the Handramit, or in the narrow depression along which their road led them, the air is of Himalayan rarity, ill-breathing for a Hross, and a few 100 feet higher, on the Harandra proper, the true surface of the planet, it admits no life. Hence the brightness through which they walked was almost that of heaven, celestial light hardly at all tempered with an atmospheric veil. The shadow of the Sorn, with Ransom's shadow on its shoulder, moved over the uneven rock unnaturally distinct, like the shadow of a tree before the headlights of a car, and the rock beyond the shadow hurt his eyes. The remote horizon seemed but an arm's length away. The fissures and molding of distant slopes were clear as the background of a primitive picture made before men learned perspective. He was on the very frontier of that heaven he had known in the spaceship, and rays that the air-enveloped worlds cannot taste were once more at work upon his body. He felt the old lift of the heart, the soaring solemnity, the sense, at once sober and ecstatic, of life and power offered in unmasked and unmeasured abundance. If there had been air enough in his lungs, he would have laughed aloud. And now, even in the immediate landscape, beauty was drawing near. Over the edge of the valley, as if it had frothed down from the true Harandra, came great curves of the rose-tinted cumular stuff which he had seen so often from a distance. Now, on a nearer view, they appeared hard as stone in substance, but puffed above and stalked beneath like vegetation. His original simile of giant cauliflower turned out to be surprisingly correct. Stone cauliflowers the size of cathedrals and the color of pale rose. He asked the Sorn what it was. "It is the old forests of Malacandra," said Orgray. "Once there was air on the Harandra, and it was warm. To this day, if you could get up there and live, you would see it all covered with the bones of ancient creatures. It was once full of life and noise. It was then these forests grew, and in and out among their stalks went a people that have vanished from the world these many thousand years. They were covered not with fur, but with a coat like mine. They did not go in the water swimming, or on the ground walking. They glided on the air on broad, flat limbs which kept them up. It is said they were great singers, and in those days the red forests echoed with their music. Now the forests have become stone, and only Eldela can go among them." "We still have such creatures in our world," said Ransom. "We call them birds. Where was Oyasa when all this happened to the Harandra?" "Where he is now." "And he could not prevent it?" "I do not know. But a world is not made to last forever, much less a race. That is not Meleldil's way." As they proceeded, the petrified forests grew more numerous, and often, for half an hour at a time, the whole horizon of the lifeless, almost airless waste blushed like an English garden in summer. They passed many caves where, as Orgray told him, Sorns lived. Sometimes a high cliff would be perforated with countless holes to the very top, and unidentifiable noises came hollowly from within. Work was in progress, said the Sorn, but of what kind it could not make him understand. Its vocabulary was very different from that of the Hrossa. Nowhere did he see anything like a village or city of Sorns, who were apparently solitary, not social creatures. Once or twice a long pallid face would show from a cavern mouth and exchange a horn-like greeting with the travelers, but for the most part the long valley, the rock street of the silent people, was still and empty as the Harandra itself. Only towards afternoon, as they were about to descend into a dip of the road, they met 3 Sorns together coming towards them down the opposite slope. They seemed to Ransom to be rather skating than walking. The lightness of their world and the perfect poise of their bodies allowed them to lean forward at right angles to the slope, and they came swiftly down like full-rigged ships before a fair wind. The grace of their movement, their lofty stature, and the softened glancing of the sunlight on their feathery sides effected a final transformation in Ransom's feelings toward their race. Ogres, he had called them, when they first met his eyes as he struggled in the grip of Weston and Devine. Titans, or angels, he now thought would have been a better word. Even the faces, it seemed to him, he had not then seen aright. He had thought them spectral when they were only august, and his first human reaction to their lengthened severity of line and profound stillness of expression now appeared to him not so much cowardly as vulgar. So might Parmenides or Confucius look to the eyes of a Cockney schoolboy. The great white creatures sailed towards Ransom and Orgray and dipped like trees and passed. In spite of the cold, which made him often dismount and take a spell on foot, he did not wish for the end of the journey. But Orgray had his own plans and halted for the night long before sundown at the home of an older Sorn. Ransom saw well enough that he was brought there to be shown to a great scientist. The cave, or so to speak more correctly, the system of excavations, was large and many-chambered, and contained a multitude of things that he did not understand. He was specially interested in a collection of rolls, seemingly of skin, covered with characters, which were clearly books. But he gathered that books were few in Malacandra. "It is better to remember," said the Sorns. When Ransom asked if valuable secrets might not thus be lost, they replied that Oyarsa always remembered them and would bring them to light if he thought fit. "The Hrossa used to have many books of poetry," they added, "but now they have fewer. They say that the writing of books destroys poetry." Their host in these caverns was attended by a number of other Sorns, who seemed to be in some way subordinate to him. Ransom thought at first that they were servants, but decided later they were pupils or assistants. The evening's conversation was not such as would interest a terrestrial reader, for the Sorns had determined that Ransom should not ask, but answer questions. Their questioning was very different from the rambling, imaginative inquiries of the Hrossa. They worked systematically from the geology of Earth to its present geography, and thence in turn to flora, fauna, human history, languages, politics, and arts. When they found that Ransom could tell them no more on a given subject, and this happened pretty soon in most of their inquiries, they dropped it at once and went on to the next. Often they drew out of him indirectly much more knowledge than he consciously possessed, apparently working from a wide background of general science. A casual remark about trees, when Ransom was trying to explain the manufacture of paper, would fill up for them a gap in his sketchy answers to their botanical questions. His account of terrestrial navigation might illuminate mineralogy, and his description of the steam engine gave them a better knowledge of terrestrial air and water than Ransom had ever had. He had decided from the outset that he would be quite frank, for he now felt that it would be not Hanahu, and also that it would be unavailing to do otherwise. They were astonished at what he had to tell them of human history, of war, slavery, and prostitution. "It is because they have no Oyarsa," said one of the pupils. "It is because every one of them wants to be a little Oyarsa himself," said Ogre. "They cannot help it," said the old Sorn. "There must be rule, yet how can creatures rule themselves? Beasts must be ruled by Hanahu, and Hanahu by Eldila, and Eldila by Meleldil. These creatures have no Eldila. They are like one trying to lift himself by his own hair, or one trying to see over a whole country when he is on a level with it, like a female trying to beget young on herself." Two things about our world particularly stuck in their minds. One was the extraordinary degree to which problems of lifting and carrying things absorbed our energy. The other was the fact that we had only one kind of Hanahu. They thought this must have far-reaching effects in the narrowing of sympathies and even of thought. "Your thought must be at the mercy of your blood," said the old Sorn, "for you cannot compare it with thoughts that float on a different blood." It was a tiring and very disagreeable conversation for Ransom, but when at last he lay down to sleep, it was not of the human nakedness, nor of his own ignorance that he was thinking. He thought only of the old forests of Malacandra, and of what it might mean to grow up seeing always so few miles away a land of color that could never be reached and had once been inhabited. Chapter 17. Early next day, Ransom again took his seat on Ogre's shoulder. For more than an hour they traveled through the same bright wilderness. Far to the north, the sky was luminous, with a cloud-like mass of dull red or ochre. It was very large and drove furiously westward about 10 miles above the waste. Ransom, who had yet seen no cloud in the Malacandrian sky, asked what it was. The Sorn told him it was sand, caught up from the great northern deserts by the winds of that terrible country. It was often thus carried, sometimes at a height of 17 miles, to fall again, perhaps in a handramit, as a choking and blinding dust storm. The sight of it moving with menace in the naked sky served to remind Ransom that they were indeed on the outside of Malacandra, no longer dwelling in a world, but crawling the surface of a strange planet. At last the cloud seemed to drop and burst far on the western horizon, where a glow, not unlike that of a conflagration, remained visible till a turn of the valley hid all that region from his view. The same turn opened a new prospect to his eyes. What lay before him looked at first strangely like an earthly landscape, a landscape of gray downland ridges rising and falling like waves of the sea. Far beyond, cliffs and spires of the familiar green rock rose against the dark blue sky. A moment later he saw that what he had taken for downlands was but the ridged and furrowed surface of a blue-gray valley mist, a mist which would not appear a mist at all when they descended into the Hadramit. And already, as their road began descending, it was less visible, and the many-colored pattern of the low country showed vaguely through it. The descent grew quickly steeper. Like the jagged teeth of a giant with very bad teeth, the topmost peaks of the mountain wall down which they must pass loomed up over the edge of their gully. The look of the sky and the quality of the light were infinitesimally changed. A moment later they stood on the edge of such a slope as by earthly standards would rather be called a precipice. Down and down this face, to where it vanished in a purple blush of vegetation, ran their road. Ransom refused absolutely to make the descent on Augray's shoulder. The Sorn, though it did not fully understand his objection, stooped for him to dismount and proceeded, with that same skating and forward-sloping motion, to go down before him. Ransom followed, using gladly but stiffly his numb legs. The beauty of this new Hadramit as it opened before him took his breath away. It was wider than that in which he had hitherto lived, and right below him lay an almost circular lake, a sapphire 12 miles in diameter, set in a border of purple forest. Amidst the lake there rose like a low and gently sloping pyramid, or like a woman's breast, an island of pale red, smooth to the summit, and on the summit a grove of such trees as man had never seen. Their smooth columns had the gentle swell of the noblest beech trees, but these were taller than a cathedral spire on earth, and at their tops they broke rather into flower than foliage, into golden flower, bright as tulip, still as rock and huge as summer cloud. Flowers indeed they were, not trees, and far down among their roots he caught a pale hint of slab-like architecture. He knew before his guide told him that this was Meldalorn. He did not know what he had expected. The old dreams which he had brought from Earth of some more than American complexity of offices, or some engineer's paradise of vast machines, had indeed been long laid aside. But he had not looked for anything quite so classic, so virginal as this bright grove, lying so still, so secret in its colored valley, soaring with inimitable grace so many 100 feet into the wintry sunlight. At every step of his descent, the comparative warmth of the valley came up to him more deliciously. He looked above, the sky was turning to a paler blue. He looked below, and sweet and faint, the thin fragrance of the giant blooms came up to him. Distant crags were growing less sharp in outline, and surfaces less bright. Depth, dimness, softness, and perspective were returning to the landscape. The lip or edge of rock from which they had started their descent was already far overhead. It seemed unlikely that they had really come from there. He was breathing freely. His toes, so long benumbed, could move delightfully inside his boots. He lifted the ear flaps of his cap and found his ears instantly filled with the sound of falling water. And now he was treading on soft groundweed over level earth, and the forest roof was above his head. They had conquered the Harandra, and were on the threshold of Meldalorn. A short walk brought them into a kind of forest ride, a broad avenue running straight as an arrow through the purple stems to where the vivid blue of the lake danced at the end of it. There they found a gong and hammer hung on a pillar of stone. These objects were all richly decorated, and the gong and hammer were of a greenish-blue metal which Ransom did not recognize. Augray struck the gong. This book is continued on cassette number 5, side 1. Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis, continuing on cassette number 5, side 1. Augray struck the gong, An excitement was rising in Ransom's mind which almost prevented him from examining as coolly as he wished the ornamentation of the stone. It was partly pictorial, partly pure decoration. What chiefly struck him was a certain balance of packed and empty surfaces. Pure line drawings, as bare as the prehistoric pictures of reindeer on Earth, alternated with patches of design as close and intricate as Norse or Celtic jewelry. And then, as you looked at it, these empty and crowded areas turned out to be themselves arranged in larger designs. He was struck by the fact that the pictorial work was not confined to the emptier spaces. Quite often large arabesques included as a subordinate detail intricate pictures. Elsewhere the opposite plan had been followed, and this alternation too had a rhythmical or patterned element in it. He was just beginning to find out that the pictures, though stylized, were obviously intended to tell a story when Augrey interrupted him. A ship had put out from the island shore of Meldalorn. As it came towards them, Ransom's heart warmed to see that it was paddled by a Hross. The creature brought its boat up to the shore where they were waiting, stared at Ransom, and then looked inquiringly at Augrey. "You may well wonder at this Na'u, Frinha," said the Sorn, "for you have never seen anything like it. It is called Rensum, and has come through heaven from Thulkandra." "It is welcome, Augrey," said the Hross politely. "Is it coming to Oyarsa?" "He has sent for it." "And for you also, Augrey?" "Oyarsa has not called me. If you will take Rensum over the water, I will go back to my tower." The Hross indicated that Ransom should enter the boat. He attempted to express his thanks to the Sorn, and after a moment's consideration unstrapped his wristwatch and offered it to him. It was the only thing he had which seemed a suitable present for a Sorn. He had no difficulty in making Augrey understand its purpose, but after examining it, the giant gave it back to him, a little reluctantly, and said, "This gift ought to be given to a Pfiffeltrig. It rejoices my heart, but they would make more of it. You are likely to meet some of the busy people in Meldalorn. Give it to them. As for its use, do your people not know except by looking at this thing how much of the day has worn?" "I believe there are beasts that have a sort of knowledge of that," said Ransom, "but our Hnau have lost it." After this, his farewells to the Sorn were made, and he embarked. To be once more in a boat, and with a Hross, to feel the warmth of water on his face and to see a blue sky above him, was almost like coming home. He took off his cap and leaned back luxuriously in the bows, plying his escort with questions. He learned that the Hrossa were not specially concerned with the service of Oyarsa, as he had surmised from finding a Hross in charge of the ferry. All three species of Hnau served him in their various capacities, and the ferry was naturally entrusted to those who understood boats. He learned that his own procedure on arriving in Meldalorn must be to go where he liked and do what he pleased until Oyarsa called for him. It might be an hour or several days before this happened. He would find huts near the landing place where he could sleep if necessary, and where food would be given him. In return, he related as much as he could make intelligible of his own world and his journey from it, and he warned the Hross of the dangerous bent men who had brought him, and who were still at large on Malacandra. As he did so, it occurred to him that he had not made this sufficiently clear to Augrey, but he consoled himself with the reflection that Weston and Devine seemed to have already some liaison with the Sorns, and that they would not be likely to molest things so large and so comparatively manlike. At any rate, not yet. About Devine's ultimate designs he had no illusions. All he could do was to make a clean breast of them to Oyarsa. And now the ship touched land. Ransom rose while the Hross was making fast and looked about him. Close to the little harbor, which they had entered, and to the left, were low buildings of stone, the first he had seen in Malacandra, and fires were burning. There, the Hross told him, he could find food and shelter. For the rest, the island seemed desolate, and its smooth slopes empty up to the grove that crowned them, where again he saw stonework. But this appeared to be neither temple nor house in the human sense, but a broad avenue of monoliths, a much larger Stonehenge, stately, empty, and vanishing over the crest of the hill into the pale shadow of the flower trunks. All was solitude, but as he gazed upon it he seemed to hear, against the background of morning silence, a faint, continual agitation of silvery sound, hardly a sound at all, if you attended to it, and yet impossible to ignore. "The island is all full of Eldelar," said the Frost in a hushed voice. He went ashore. As though half expecting some obstacle, he took a few hesitant paces forward and stopped, and then went on again in the same fashion. Though the groundweed was unusually soft and rich, and his feet made no noise upon it, he felt an impulse to walk on tiptoes. All his movements became gentle and sedate. The width of water about this island made the air warmer than any he had yet breathed in Malacandra. The climate was almost that of a warm earthly day in late September, a day that is warm but with a hint of frost to come. A sense of awe which was increasing upon him deterred him from approaching the crown of the hill, the grove, and the avenue of standing stones. He ceased ascending about halfway up the hill and began walking to his right, keeping a constant distance from the shore. He said to himself that he was having a look at the island, but his feeling was rather that the island was having a look at him. This was greatly increased by a discovery he made after he had been walking for about an hour, and which he ever afterwards found great difficulty in describing. In the most abstract terms, it might be summed up by saying that the surface of the island was subject to tiny variations of light and shade, which no change in the sky accounted for. If the air had not been calm and the groundweed too short and firm to move in the wind, he would have said that a faint breeze was playing with it, and working such slight alterations in the shading as it does in a cornfield on the earth. Like the silvery noises in the air, these footsteps of light were shy of observation. Where he looked hardest, they were least to be seen. On the edges of his field of vision they came crowding as though a complex arrangement of them were there in progress. To attend to any one of them was to make it invisible, and the minute brightness seemed often to have just left the spot where his eyes fell. He had no doubt that he was seeing, as much as he ever would see, the Eldelar. The sensation it produced in him was curious. It was not exactly uncanny, not as if he were surrounded by ghosts. It was not even as if he were being spied upon. He had rather the sense of being looked at by things that had a right to look. His feeling was less than fear. It had in it something of embarrassment, something of shyness, something of submission, and it was profoundly uneasy. He felt tired, and thought that in this favored land it would be warm enough to rest out of doors. He sat down. The softness of the weed, the warmth and the sweet smell which pervaded the whole island reminded him of earth and gardens in summer. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them again and noticed buildings below him, and over the lake he saw a boat approaching. Recognition suddenly came to him. That was the ferry, and these buildings were the guest house beside the harbor. He had walked all round the island. A certain disappointment succeeded this discovery. He was beginning to feel hungry. Perhaps it would be a good plan to go down and ask for some food. At any rate, it would pass the time. But he did not do so. When he rose and looked more closely at the guest house, he saw a considerable stir of creatures about it. And while he watched, he saw that a full load of passengers was landing from the ferry boat. In the lake he saw some moving objects which he did not at first identify, but which turned out to be swans up to their middles in the water, and obviously wading to Meldalorn from the mainland. There were about 10 of them. For some reason or other, the island was receiving an influx of visitors. He no longer supposed that any harm would be done to him if he went down and mixed in the crowd, but he felt a reluctance to do so. The situation brought vividly back to his mind his experience as a new boy at school. New boys came a day early, hanging about and watching the arrival of the old hands. In the end, he decided not to go down. He cut and ate some of the groundweed and dozed a little. In the afternoon, when it grew colder, he resumed his walking. Other Hanau were roaming about the island by this time. He saw swans, chiefly, but this was because their height made them conspicuous. There was hardly any noise. His reluctance to meet these fellow wanderers, who seemed to confine themselves to the coast of the island, drove him half-consciously upwards and inwards. he found himself at last on the fringes of the grove and looked straight up the monolithic avenue. He had intended, for no very clearly defined reason, not to enter it, but he fell to studying the stone nearest to him, which was richly sculptured on all its four sides, and after that curiosity led him on from stone to stone. The pictures were very puzzling. Side by side with representations of Sorns and Hrotha, and what he supposed to be Pfiffeltrigge, there occurred again and again an upright wavy figure, with only the suggestion of a face, and with wings. The wings were perfectly recognizable, and this puzzled him very much. Could it be that the traditions of Malacandrian art went back to that earlier geological and biological era when, as Augre had told him, there was life, including bird life, on the Harandra? The answer of the stones seemed to be yes. He saw pictures of the old red forests with unmistakable birds flying among them, and many other creatures that he did not know. On another stone, many of these were represented lying dead, and a fantastic Hanakra-like figure, presumably symbolizing the cold, was depicted in the sky above them, shooting at them with darts. Creatures still alive were crowding round the winged wavy figure, which he took to be Oyarsa, pictured as a winged flame. On the next stone, Oyarsa appeared, followed by many creatures, and apparently making a furrow with some pointed instrument. Another picture showed the furrow being enlarged by Pfiffeltrigge with digging tools. Sorns were piling the earth up in pinnacles on each side, and Hrotha seemed to be making water channels. Ransom wondered whether this were a mythical account of the making of Handramits, or whether they were conceivably artificial in fact. Many of the pictures he could make nothing of. One that particularly puzzled him showed at the bottom a segment of a circle, behind and above which rose 3/4 of a disk divided into concentric rings. He thought it was a picture of the sun rising behind a hill. Certainly the segment at the bottom was full of Malacandrian scenes, Oyarsa in Meldalorn, Sorns on the mountain edge of the Harandra, and many other things both familiar to him and strange. He turned from it to examine the disk which rose behind it. It was not the sun. The sun was there, unmistakably, at the center of the disk. Round this, the concentric circles revolved. In the first and smallest of these was pictured a little ball, on which rode a winged figure, something like Oyarsa, but holding what appeared to be a trumpet. In the next, a similar ball carried another of the flaming figures. This one, instead of even the suggested face, had two bulges, which, after long inspection, he decided were meant to be the udders or breasts of a female mammal. By this time he was quite sure that he was looking at a picture of the solar system. The first ball was Mercury, the second Venus, and what an extraordinary coincidence, thought Ransom, that their mythology, like ours, associates some idea of the female with Venus. The problem would have occupied him longer if a natural curiosity had not drawn his eyes on to the next ball, which must represent the earth. The ball was there, but where a flame-like figure should have been, a deep depression of irregular shape had been cut as if to erase it. Once, then, but his speculations faltered and became silent before a series of unknowns. He looked at the bottom circle. Here there was no ball. Instead, the bottom of this circle touched the top of the big segment filled with Malacandrian scenes, so that Malacandra at this point touched the solar system and came out of it in perspective towards the spectator. Now that his mind had grasped the design, he was astonished at the vividness of it all. He stood back and drew a deep breath, preparatory to tackling some of the mysteries in which he was engulfed. Malacandra, then, was Mars. The Earth... But at this point, a sound of tapping or hammering, which had been going on for some time without gaining admission to his consciousness, became too insistent to be ignored. Some creature, and certainly not an Eldil, was at work close to him. A little startled, for he had been deep in thought, he turned round. There was nothing to be seen. He shouted out, idiotically in English, "Who's there?" The tapping instantly stopped, and a remarkable face appeared from behind a neighboring monolith. It was hairless, like a man's or a Sorn's. It was long and pointed like a shrew's, yellow and shabby-looking, and so low in the forehead that, but for the heavy development of the head at the back and behind the ears, like a bagwig, it could not have been that of an intelligent creature. A moment later, the whole of the thing came into view with a startling jump. Ransom guessed that it was a piffle-trig, and was glad that he had not met one of this third race on his first arrival in Malacandra. It was much more insect-like or reptilian than anything he had yet seen. Its build was distinctly that of a frog, and at first Ransom thought it was resting frog-like on its hands. Then he noticed that part of its forelimbs on which it was supported was really, in human terms, rather an elbow than a hand. It was broad and padded and clearly made to be walked on, but upwards from it, at an angle of about 45 degrees, went the true forearms, thin, strong forearms, ending in enormous, sensitive, many-fingered hands. He realized that for all the manual work from mining to cutting cameos, this creature had the advantage of being able to work with its full strength from a supported elbow. The insect-like effect was due to the speed and jerkiness of its movements, and to the fact that it could swivel its head almost all the way round like a mantis, and it was increased by a kind of dry, rasping, jingling quality in the noise of its moving. It was rather like a grasshopper, rather like one of Arthur Rackham's dwarfs, rather like a frog, and rather like a little old taxidermist whom Ransom knew in London. "I come from another world," began Ransom. I know," said the creature in a quick, twittering, rather impatient voice. "Come here, behind the stone. This way. Oyas's orders. Very busy, must begin at once. Stand here." Ransom found himself on the other side of the monolith, staring at a picture which was still in process of completion. The ground was liberally strewn with chips, and the air was full of dust. "There," said the creature. "Stand still. Don't look at me. Look over there." For a moment Ransom did not quite understand what was expected of him. Then, as he saw the piffle-trig glancing to and fro at him and at the stone, with the unmistakable glance of artist from model to work, which is the same in all worlds, he realized and almost laughed. He was standing for his portrait. From his position he could see that the creature was cutting the stone as if it were cheese, and the swiftness of its movements almost baffled his eyes, but he could get no impression of the work done, though he could study the piffle-trig. He saw that the jingling and metallic noise was due to the number of small instruments which it carried about its body. Sometimes, with an exclamation of annoyance, it would throw down the tool it was working with and select one of these, but the majority of those in immediate use it kept in its mouth. He realized also that this was an animal artificially clothed, like himself, in some bright, scaly substance which appeared richly decorated, though coated in dust. It had folds of furry clothing about its throat like a comforter, and its eyes were protected by dark, bulging goggles. Rings and chains of a bright metal, not gold, he thought, adorned its limbs and neck. All the time it was working, it kept up a sort of hissing whisper to itself, and when it was excited, which it usually was, the end of its nose wrinkled like a rabbit's. At last it gave another startling leap, landed about 10 yards away from its work, and said, Yes, not so good as I hoped. Do better another time. Leave it now. Come and see yourself." Ransom obeyed. He saw a picture of the planets, not now arranged to make a map of the solar system, but advancing in a single procession towards the spectator, and all save one bearing its fiery charioteer. Below lay Malacandra, and there, to his surprise, was a very tolerable picture of the spaceship. Beside it stood 3 figures, for all of which Ransom had apparently been the model. He recoiled from them in disgust. Even allowing for the strangeness of the subject from a Malacandrian point of view, and for the stylization of their art, still, he thought, the creature might have made a better attempt at the human form than these stock-like dummies, almost as thick as they were tall, and sprouting about the head and neck into something that looked like fungus. He hedged. "I expect it is like me as I look to your people," he said. "It is not how they would draw me in my own world." "No," said the piffle-trig, "I do not mean it to be too like, and they will not believe it, those who are born after." He added a good deal more which was difficult to understand, but while he was speaking it dawned upon Ransom that the odious figures were intended as an idealization of humanity. Conversation languished for a little. To change the subject, Ransom asked a question which had been in his mind for some time. "I cannot understand," he said, "how you and the Sorns and the Hrossa all come to speak the same speech. For your tongues and teeth and throats must be very different." "You are right," said the creature. Once we all had different speeches, and we still have at home, but everyone has learned the speech of the Hrossa." "Why is that?" said Ransom, still thinking in terms of terrestrial history. "Did the Hrossa once rule the others?" "I do not understand. They are great speakers and singers. They have more words and better. No one learns the speech of my people, for what we have to say is set in stone, and sun's blood and star's milk, and all can see them. No one learns the Sorn's speech, for you can change their knowledge into any words, and it is still the same. You cannot do that with the songs of the Hrossa. Their tongue goes all over Malacandra. I speak it to you because you are a stranger. I would speak it to a Sorn. But we have our old tongues at home. You can see it in the names. The Sorns have big-sounding names like Ogre and Arkal and Belmo and Palme. The Hrossa have furry names like Tno and Jinihi and Joy and Tlithnahi." "The best poetry, then, comes in the roughest speech?" "Perhaps," said the Pipipiltrig, "as the best pictures are made in the hardest stone. But my people have names like Kalakaperi and Parakataru and Tafalakeruf. I am called Kanakaberika." Ransom told it his name. "In our country," said Kanakaberika, "it is not like this. We are not pinched in the narrow Handramit. There are the true forests, the green shadows, the deep mines. It is warm. It does not blaze with light like this, and it is not silent like this. I could put you in a place there in the forest where you could see 100 fires at once and hear 100 hammers. I wish you would come to our country. We do not live in holes like the Sorns, nor in bundles of weed like the Hrossa. I could show you houses with 100 pillars, one of sun's blood and the next of star's milk all the way, and all the world painted on the walls." "How do you rule yourselves?" asked Ransom. "Those who are digging in the mines, do they like it as much as those who paint the walls?" "All keep the mines open. It is a work to be shared. But each digs for himself the thing he wants for his work. What else would he do?" "It is not so with us." "Then you must make very bent work. How would a maker understand working in sun's blood unless he went into the home of sun's blood himself and knew one kind from another and lived with it for days out of the light of the sky, till it was in his blood and his heart, as if he thought it and ate it and spat it? With us it lies very deep and hard to get. Those who dig it must spend their whole lives on the skill." "And they love it?" "I think not. I do not know. They are kept at it because they are given no food if they stop." Kanakaberika wrinkled his nose. "Then there is not food in plenty on your world?" "I do not know," said Ransom. "I have often wished to know the answer to that question, but no one can tell me. Does no one keep your people at their work, Kanakaberika?" "Our females," said the Pipipiltrig, with a piping noise which was apparently his equivalent for a laugh. "Are your females of more account among you than those of the other Khanahu among them?" "Very great. The Sorns make least account of females, and we make most.